My name is Glenn Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation. We're delighted that you're here with us this afternoon. And if you're following us in the morning in Asia, we hope you welcome you as well and other participants. We're delighted that everyone is joining in this discussion today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to everyone John Van Oudenaren, who is the new China Program Manager at Jamestown and also Editor-in-Chief of China Brief. And he'll be moderating in this discussion today, and I'll turn the floor over to him, but we will be posting this online afterwards on YouTube if you didn't get a chance to watch it. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Glenn, for that kind introduction. As Glenn noted, we've got a fantastic panel today to discuss this longstanding and important relationship that's sort of flown under the radar for a long time. So we have with us former Assistant Secretary of State David Stilwell, most recent Assistant Top Diplomat for Asia. We have Abraham Denmark, the Director of Asia Policy at the Wilson Center, and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. We have Yuki Tatsumi, who's director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center and the author of a recent edited book on the Japan-Taiwan relationship, which is a great resource. I really encourage everyone to check that out. And then finally, last but not least, we have Russell Shao, who's executive director of the Global Taiwan Institute and also a senior fellow with us at the Jamestown Foundation. I'd like to start us off with Yuki, because I think there's been maybe the most kind of change, at least as far as rhetoric goes on the Japanese side. And there's also been some major developments, of course, today with the LDP election results. So it'll be interesting to get her perception on how that may impact this relationship. So Yuki, if we can kick it off with you, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for having this, giving me this opportunity. It's great to join this great colleagues on this panel discussion. So look forward to what I can learn from other panelists moving forward. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for chiming in this afternoon. My name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a co-director of East Asia Studies and director of Japan Studies at Stimson. And as John rightly noted, I think Japan's relationship with Taiwan, or I guess to be more specific, how Japan articulates its interest in Taiwan in what context have been relatively quickly changing in the last 18 months or so. And first, I think people began to notice that the shift in tone of Japan's articulation of its interest in Taiwan when its defense white paper, annual defense white paper, when it came out this past summer, for the first time, even if it was a small section, it actually created a different section to discuss Taiwan and how stability of the stability across the Taiwan Strait is part of Japan's critical national security interests. And even though that has been articulated by the various members of the Japanese parliament and also by the Japanese officials, it really has, it really did draw some attention to see that written and spelled out in the defense white paper. And as I alluded to, Japan's interest in Taiwan is very close to its own national security due to its geographical proximity that Taiwan has to Japanese territory. Something bad happens in Taiwan Strait, which has a very high likelihood of it quickly escalates into Japan's own national security crisis. So for that matter, for the longest time, even though it has not been openly discussed, to Japan, peace and stability of Taiwan Strait and also preventing Taiwan from forcefully reunified has been a very important foreign policy and national security interest of Japan. But given the growing assertiveness and aggressiveness of People's Republic of China, not only around East China Sea, which has been the standing issue between Japan and PRC, but increasing aggressiveness in the South China Sea, really challenging the rule-based international order in the Indo-Pacific region writ large, really drove Japan to articulate its interest in Taiwan, specifically peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, more openly and more publicly. And recent developments, mainly PRC's increased activity, not just around Japanese territory, but then increasing incursion into Taiwanese air defense identification zones, and increasing amount of aggressive behaviors by its fishery boat and Coast Guard ships, really motivated Japanese politicians, especially those in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, to create the Taiwan Project Team, to really take a wholesale look at the Japan's standing policy toward Taiwan and what part can be improved, or what part of the Japan-Taiwan relationship needs to be elevated a little bit more. And this project team did submit its interim policy recommendations to incumbent Suga government in June. And that really included a whole slew of a recommendation, everything from Japan, their belief that it is time for Japan to consider enacting something akin to a Japanese version of a Taiwan Relations Act, to how to explore greater opportunities, even if its official relationship with Taiwan remains unofficial. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but what other areas of cooperation that Japan should be pursuing with Taiwan. And what you really see that political change in the within this Liberal Democratic Party in the most recent presidential competition for its party leadership. And as many of us in the audience know, former Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida won that election on 29th of September. So come October, he will be named to succeed incumbent Prime Minister Suga. But Mr. Kishida has long been known to be more on the dovish side of the party. But when the competition started for this LDP presidency, he was actually the first one that came out with a number of really concrete policy suggestions that he would like to implement if he comes into power. Everything from appointing special advisor for the prime minister on the human rights violation issues in China, to more concrete measures of how to call China out for its misbehaviors in various areas. And that really is the embodiment of the contextual change amongst Japanese political elites in which Taiwan has been discussed, or Japan-Taiwan relationship has been discussed. And there is a ever-growing interest on the Japanese side, especially among retired self-defense force officers, to try to enhance the existing communication channel and existing opportunity to meet and keep a consult with their Taiwanese colleague, also retired, but then search for more ways to have their own input as a result of those consultations into Japanese leadership. And that has been articulated at numerous Track 2 dialogues. And more recently, I think there has been an increasing interest on the Japan side to expand cooperation in some feasible in a way that feasible manner in the Coast Guard realm. So Japanese Coast Guard and Taiwanese Coast Guard. I think Coast Guard actually cooperation not only between Japan and Taiwan, but then actually leverage the existing relationship that U.S. Coast Guard already has with Taiwanese Coast Guard, and use that as almost like a stepping stone to get Japan a little bit more involved, seem to be the one of the main areas that Japan's defense establishment has showing a very strong interest in. And going back to your initial question, John, about what does this leadership change means? I think what I just said about Fumio Kishida's policy outlook when he was running for the LDP president, I think really speaks very big, because if this is the voice from who is considered to be the dovish side of the party, I think there is a big shift in the consensus over the importance of Taiwan and what kind of a role Japan needs and should play in the event of any kind of a contingency in Taiwan, across the Taiwan Strait. That center of that debate is really shifting toward looking for more concrete action items that Japan can implement in this realm. So I really don't think you will see, I guess it's for the lack of a better word, I don't see any softening of Japan's stance vis-a-vis PRC. Even under Mr. Kishida's realm, but then everybody else. So Kishida was considered the softest when it comes to his stance on China. Everybody else was considered to be the right of him. So if his voice, which was ultimately elected, was no longer exactly the left of the center, bulk majority of the party consensus is definitely the right of the center. And how much of a stability that his policy initiative could take really does depend on how well LDP-Komeito coalition will perform in the upcoming general election for the House of Representatives. But as long as ruling coalition does well enough for Mr. Kishida to justify that now is not the time of leadership change, but it's rather to have a steady hand of the government and continue to implement what's already been decided. And if there's a room for improvement, it's much better to have a steady government that can consider more of a how to implement those unfulfilled goals. As long as he can make his ruling coalition wins big enough for him to be able to make that argument in a convincing manner, we will unlikely to see a change in the kind of a wobbly leadership up in Tokyo, and that does benefit Japan-Taiwan relations, and also U.S.-Japan-Taiwan collaboration moving forward. So I'll stop at that, and I will look forward to learning from everybody else.
Thanks, Yuki. That's a really great overview, and it's kind of fascinating to hear about the shifting center of political gravity in Japan vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. Let's go now to Russell, who's going to look at things from the Taiwanese perspective. Russell, can you just talk us through quickly some of the recent kind of drivers and constraints in the relationship, and then maybe give us a little bit of the outlook on the relationship for the remainder of the President Tsai's term? Thanks.
Sure, thanks a lot. And thanks to Glenn and John for the invitation to speak at this timely event and the privilege to virtually sit alongside this very distinguished panel. So I've been asked to provide an assessment of Taiwan-Japan relations from the vantage point of Taipei. John was, as he just articulated, outlined some specific questions for me to address, and I'll get to those questions later in this opening statement. But first, I want to start by quickly leading off on some indicators that I think are often overlooked in elements in this discussion about bilateral ties between Taipei and Tokyo. And I do this because leaders in Taiwan and Japan reference them routinely in their statements, and they could be treated simply as platitudes, but I actually think they have meaningful depth. And I don't think that they are well understood here in Washington. Those elements are the economic and the people-to-people ties. I think in interest of time, I'll just provide some relevant data points before turning to the regional security and strategic questions that John just presented, again, from my assessment of Taipei's vantage point. On the economic front, let me briefly just touch on trade, investment, and tourism. First, Japan is Taiwan's third largest trading partner, behind the PRC in first and the US in second, which accounts for about 11% of Taiwan's total trade in goods. Japan is also Taiwan's second largest source of imports and fourth largest destinations for exports. On investments, Japan is the 5th largest source of investments in Taiwan. On tourism, and I'm referencing data from 2019 for normal pre-COVID indicators, 18% of tourists, that's over 2 million, to Taiwan were from Japan. Now, this makes Japanese tourists the 2nd largest group after those of the PRC, which stood at around 3 million pre-COVID. While Taiwan is not dependent on tourism and other economic levers are increasingly being utilized by China to apply pressure on Taiwan. And this has come in the form of restricting tourists, the banning of imports of certain agricultural products such as fruits, most recently pineapples, and then now, most recently, wax and custard apples, which were the targets of Beijing's import restrictions from Taiwan. Now, Japan's purchase of pineapples following the Chinese ban more than helped offset the decrease of imports from China, and that's an interesting dynamic of the Taiwan-Japan relationship that we could get into later. But I do expect that we will see Beijing pull more of these economic levers for coercive ends going forward. Turning to the people-to-people ties, as I noted earlier, the strength of ties between Taiwan and Japan is oft-stated, but not really well understood here in Washington, D.C. But it is a real and tangible element in the bilateral relationship. Close observers would often reference how President Lee Teng-hui considered himself Japanese, having been born during Japan's colonial rule, and then Japanese and then Chinese in his younger years, before identifying as Taiwanese and also as a Presbyterian. While President Lee certainly personifies the historical and intimate linkages between Taiwan and Japan, the bilateral relationship transcends that generation and is broader and even deeper now. According to the latest poll result from the 2019, this was released by the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association, which is the de facto embassy of Japan in Taiwan, which asked respondents in Taiwan their favorite country besides Taiwan. The overwhelming majority listed Japan at 59%. This preference for Japan as their favorite country was clearly evident among the younger population, with those in the 30 to 39 age group at 70%, and those in the 20 to 29 age group at 66%. Now, in terms of countries with which Taiwan should become closer with, 37% expressed that Taiwan should become closer with Japan, 31% listed China. Now, again, the favorable disposition of Taiwanese attitudes towards Japan is especially clear among the younger population, with those in the 30 to 39 age group at 48%, and those in the 20 to 29 age group at 46%. Now, finally, 50% of respondents in that poll also indicated that they thought Japan was either reliable or very reliable, with only around 9% stating that they thought Japan was either unreliable or very unreliable. Now, with the recent delivery of the 5th batch of vaccines from Japan to Taiwan, which brings the total to around 3.9 million, it's almost certain that Japan's favorability ratings have only increased among the population over recent years. A last point about people-to-people relations, the Taiwan-Japan Exchange Federation, which is a caucus established in Taiwan's legislative yuan, its parliament, to promote interactions between lawmakers in the two countries, has the highest number of members with 95, and the membership cuts across the political spectrum. It is, I believe, still the largest foreign affairs caucus, even larger than that of the US-Taiwan Exchange Federation that was just stood up last year in 2020 with 71 members when it was established. Now, that number could have increased over the year, but that's the latest figure that I have. These numbers alone don't capture the depth of the bilateral relationship, but I do think they buttress the strategic dimension of the warming relations between Taiwan and Japan, and which I will turn to now. You know, at the strategic level, I think it's clear that Taiwan seeks closer relations with Japan to help balance the growing threat posed by the PRC to Taiwan, a threat that is increasingly felt not only by Taiwan, but also China's other neighbors, especially those near, but also increasingly far. Taiwan and Japan are both geographically situated on the first island chain that spans from Japan down to the Philippines, with Taiwan right dead center at the midpoint. The critical importance of Japan is based on a logical assumption that any possibility of an intervention by the United States, Taiwan's primary security partner, in a Taiwan contingency would necessarily require the use of bases in Japan and the support of Japanese forces in some capacity. Now, as China has become increasingly aggressive militarily, politically and diplomatically, there are greater alignments than ever on the threat perceptions of Taiwanese and Japanese leaders. It is in this context that since 2019, President Tsai Ing-wen has been publicly calling for a high-level security dialogue with Japan. Now, bear in mind that security dialogues have been ongoing at the working level for some time. As the threat of war increases, though, from Taipei's perspective, it is all the more important that there is closer, high-level coordination in peacetime to align strategies and tactics in integrated ways that would better deter China from using military force against Taiwan. While policymakers in Taiwan of all stripes, except perhaps the Reds, and they do operate there, generally agree that Taiwan-Japan relations are important, there are differences between the ruling and opposition parties in their approach to Japan. Now, the opposition party traditionally has taken more of a harder line against Japan on territorial sovereignty issue over Senkaku Diaoyutai, historical issues such as over the comfort women, whereas the ruling party has generally viewed Japan as an ally for facing down the threat of China and would prefer to deal with those other thorny issues more quietly. Now, despite the fundamental differences between the ruling and opposition parties on approaches to these issues, the two sides have largely agreed that maintaining close ties with Tokyo is important for Taiwan's security. This is reflected in the fact that Taipei and Tokyo were able to sign the landmark fisheries agreement in 2013 under the Ma Ying-jeou administration, just after 17 years of negotiations, and also this is reflective of the KMT's understanding that despite their differences on historical issues and territorial sovereignty, cooperation with Tokyo is necessary, and despite simmering tensions between Taiwan and Japan during that same period of time. At the same time, Beijing is continuing to utilize all tools of political warfare to exacerbate those tensions within Taiwan and between Taiwan and Japan. There are indications that after the DPP came into power and the channels for United Front exchanges were closed, were at least put under closer scrutiny, the CCP's political warfare apparatuses are turning their attention to Japan. From United Front exchanges focused on the collaborative efforts of the KMT and CCP in the war against Japanese aggression, and also reflected on the change of the portfolio in key personnel involved in a major political warfare outfit, switching from a focus on Taiwan over to Japan. We can get into that later in the Q&A if people are interested. Anyone who is interested on how the CCP and the PLA is organized for political warfare, you can read a report that I co-authored with my former colleague, Mark Stokes, the executive director of Project 2049 Institute on political warfare with Chinese characteristic, which is available on their website. So quickly, what are the prospects for future engagement? In my view, the prospects for future engagement between Taiwan and Japan are strong. I think the longstanding party-to-party exchanges are certainly to continue. Local exchanges at the municipality levels have been picking up. There are prospects for potential high-level exchanges. I would reference the 2017 visit by the Senior Vice Minister of Internal Affairs and Communication, Akama, who went to Taiwan. He was the highest level government official from Japan to visit Taiwan since 1972. Former Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori's visit to Taiwan twice in a time span of about 1 month in last year to pay his respect to Li Denghui. There's also ongoing dialogues on maritime cooperation that began since 2016. I think it's instructive that the wide sort of range of stakeholders that are involved at the governmental level in that dialogue is reflective of a more sort of comprehensive approach to dealing with security ties between the two sides. There's also the Taiwan-Japan Fisheries Commission that started after the signing of the fisheries agreement in 2013, and they've been holding annual dialogues to really deal with the nuts and bolts issues of maritime rights, and those are certainly very critical in the bilateral economic ties between the two sides. There are economic and trade initiatives as well. Some new, sort of initiatives include also the U.S.-Japan-Taiwan trilateral dialogue between the lawmakers in July. It's notable that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe participated in that. There's also the newly launched 2+2 dialogue, or so-called 2+2 dialogue between the ruling parties, the LDP and the DPP in August, between the senior lawmakers who are responsible for foreign and defense affairs of the two parties. And as Yuki referenced earlier, there's a plethora of track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues going on constantly between Taipei and Tokyo. I would take particular note of a final initiative and close there. But one that it's especially important is the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. And this was launched in 2015 between the United States and Taiwan, but Japan joined in March of 2019 as a formal partner. And since then, the three sides have held 22 workshops and on cybersecurity issues, transnational crime, women empowerment, humanitarian, you name it. I mean, and to artificial intelligence. And really the purpose of these workshops are to be able to engage third-party countries to help build the capacity of these countries to show where Taiwan has the means and the willingness to contribute to the international community, where the door to existing institutions may be closed due to Beijing's objections. And with that, I mean, I will end by just stating that that they're of course not without obstacles in the bilateral relationship. There is disputes over Okinotori, the Senkaku Diaoyutai. There's also on matters related to bilateral trade. But if we would like to get into that later, I'd be happy to discuss that. So I'll turn it over to you, John, and look forward to the comments of the other panelists.
Thanks so much, Russell. That was a really comprehensive and detailed overview. All right, we're going to zoom out here a little bit and like to turn now and just to kind of talk about the broader paradigms of the relationship. We've talked about Japan and Taiwan, but obviously, two other actors, the US and China, comprise kind of the left and right margins of the relationship. So I want to turn now to Abraham Denmark and I want to ask him for his perspective on how the relationship has evolved since 2015. Obviously that was a very different time in cross-strait relations with the Ma Ying-jeou administration. Obviously different players in the US and Japan as well. So Abraham, if you don't mind, just kind of expounding a little bit on that and giving us your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see some old friends on this panel, and including former Assistant Secretary Stilwell, who was actually my counterpart in the Joint Chiefs before he retired from the military. He was there when I first came into the Pentagon as DASD, and he really helped me get my feet under me in those first weeks and months. So it's wonderful to see everybody again, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. From an American perspective, I actually think there's been a great deal of continuity in how the United States views the security of Japan and the security of Taiwan as linked. And that goes back just really to our experiences during the Second World War, and it's linked to simple geography, that Japan's westernmost island is less than 100 miles from Taiwan's east coast. And the recognition that the loss of Taiwan to the PRC would give China the ability to completely cut off Japan's sea and air lines of communication, representing both, for Japan, an existential threat, but also a serious deterioration in the overall regional balance of power, giving China free access to the Western Pacific, as well as to the Philippines, to encircle the Philippines as well. That's all been true this entire time. I think Americans generally have recognized the ties between the security of Taiwan and the security of Japan. What I think has changed, rather, has been broader regional concerns about China's rise, driven especially in the case of Japan and Taiwan. We have a DPP government that is more willing to recognize the security challenges that Taiwan faces, and more willing to engage Japan, as Russell just described, but also changes in Japan and Japan's willingness to both accept turbulence with Beijing and to publicly acknowledge Japan's interest in the security of Taiwan, which represents, I think, a major change in how Japan has interpreted pacifism. and the role of the Japan Self-Defense Force. If they see Taiwan, rightly, I would say, as linked to the security of Japan, the defense of Japan, that raises questions about pacifism itself and how Japan interprets those elements of its constitution. I think Japan is concerned about Taiwan's role, both from a security perspective, but also Taiwan's role in critical economic areas, such as semiconductors, which are essential to the Japanese economy, but also recognizing that Taiwan has a critical role to play in pursuing and achieving Japan's vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, originally described by Prime Minister Abe, adopted and adapted by the United States during the Trump administration, and further adapted by the Biden administration. And so I think we're going to see stronger cooperation between the United States and Japan on Taiwan. We've already seen some of that in terms of cooperation on vaccine support for Taiwan. But I think we're not going to be able to make progress on this relationship, on enhancing Japan-Taiwan ties, without their support. This is something that the United States has been pushing for a long time, and it's the willingness and the interest of the governments in Taipei and Tokyo that really have allowed us to make progress here. So I would expect more cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Taiwan to deepen even further, to facilitate the diversification of Taiwan's economic linkages, and to expand functional cooperation between the United States, Japan, as well as other democratic allies and partners around the region, and even around the world, I should say. The entire goal, I think, being to enhance Taiwan's resilience and to complicate Beijing's calculations should they look to coerce or attack Taiwan. The deeper economic, political linkages that Taiwan has with Japan, with the rest of the region, with the rest of the world, the more capable the United States and other countries are of defending Taiwan, the more complex Beijing's calculations are, and the stronger deterrence will be, at least is the theory. So a few areas where I think US, Japan, Taiwan cooperation may deepen, with a lot of question marks in this list of opportunities. Probably one of the most consequential areas where cooperation could thrive, but also one of the most difficult, will be in economic ties. Both in terms of bilateral agreements, there's already been a lot of discussion about the close economic ties between Taiwan and Japan, but also multilaterally, the main question mark here being CPTPP. I feel confident that Japan will oppose China's efforts to join CPTPP. Many, I expect, in Japan will call for the support of Taiwan to join, but that's a major geopolitical risk. And it's especially risky in this case because the United States, not being a member of CPTPP, can only do so much to support and defend Japan from the inevitable Chinese response to any sort of effort to encourage Taiwan's ascension. So I think that remains an open question mark, but certainly I think both the United States and Japan have an interest in deepening Taiwan's economic ties one way or another, be it through a series of bilateral agreements or more formally through the CPTPP. Other initiatives such as supply chain security, I think, is going to drive deeper cooperation with these countries, especially when it comes to semiconductors, which is already a focus for the United States, for the Biden administration, as for the Trump administration before it. The other, I think, issue that we need to look at is the role of other allies and partners. The obvious countries that we would want to talk more about cooperation on Taiwan being Australia, India, but also countries outside the region like the United Kingdom, I think should be part of discussions, be it track 1, 1.5, or track 2, talking about the role that other countries can play in engaging with Taiwan and supporting Taiwan one way or another. And one idea I've heard from a former senior official, I haven't seen if they've talked about it publicly or not, so I won't identify them, has been to hold a series of tabletop exercises with countries in Europe, with the United Kingdom, with the French, with other countries in the region, the Indians, in which the exercise begins, the simulation begins post-unification, after Taiwan has been assimilated into the PRC. And in this scenario, thinking about its implications for the region and the world and for these countries that may seem geographically far, but helping them recognize that this is that the status of Taiwan would very much be in their national interest as well. We've already made good progress in working with Taiwan on defending democracy through the GCTF and engaging with other countries to support that. But really, Taiwan is on the front lines of authoritarian pressure on our democratic systems. And so learning from their experiences to fight disinformation, to secure cyber networks, to secure democratic processes, I think is something that countries all around the region, including the United States and Australia, as well as Japan, could learn from. And finally, militarily, I think there's good opportunities for the United States and Japan to cooperate on the defense of Taiwan and making that a more explicit element of allied interest and allied focus. And that deals with everything from posture. Japan has already been adjusting its posture in the Southwest Islands to enhancing capabilities from anti-ship cruise missiles to air and missile defense, as well as cooperating in the defense, in the development of distributed island defense operational concepts. We're working together on experimenting on how to do this, on how island defense could work in the current and future military environments. I think is something that the United States, Japan, and Taiwan would have a great deal of interest in, and could work together to figure out how best we could do it both unilaterally, bilaterally, and even multilaterally. So those are some of my initial thoughts on this. I do think this is an important area of focus. I'm very glad that the Jamestown Foundation is focusing on this, and I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Abraham. That's a great overview of the kind of change, but also the continuity and the relationship. And I think we definitely need a copy of this tabletop exercise, the post-unification that you described, to be played in Washington, because to kind of, I think that's a great way to kind of illustrate the strategic importance of Taiwan. I think that's a great segue to our next and final speaker, David Stillwell, who's going to give us an assessment of sort of how far, what is the outlook for the relationship, how far can it go, and what does the situation look like for these two key partners in an East Asia where China is increasingly powerful and assertive. David?
Hey, thank you for that. And thanks to Jamestown, Glenn, and all for letting me participate. I will say that the previous three speakers covered all my points. So with that, I'm going to go time back, Senate style. But now let me see if I can just kind of wrap it up and then get to your point about the limits of future cooperation and all the rest. When this topic comes up, sadly, I think the first thing everybody thinks about looks like this. You know, one of the headlines of recent ideas on Japan-Taiwan cooperation by a great thinker, Grant Newsham. But we all tend to flex to the most dangerous, the most fraught, and the least productive, and that's the military relationship. But again, as the previous three speakers very happily pointed out, there are other areas of cooperation and support that we can offer that basically, you know, take on the PRC at its own game. And this isn't just about that; it's about supporting a like-minded ally as well. So. Again, I'll note just a few things that the trend lines, as Tatsumi-san raised, the trend lines are fantastic. There's very little good news today, these days, as you watch Senate hearings and all that, but watching the relationship between Japan and Taiwan develop, and some very strong statements from leaders in Japan and publications gives me hope that we can take a collective security approach to preventing the unthinkable that would be so disruptive, not only to the people of Taiwan, but to the region, the globe, and the global situation, not just the economy. And this is our advantage. We should focus on this. The one advantage we have is like-minded allies, partners, shared values, and the fact that we can all cooperate. And some would say gang up. I say, cooperate on a problem that is developing and has been intentionally being pushed by a major regional power. You mentioned Australia. I mean, it's not just Japan, it's Australia and other allies and partners. One of the points I was going to make, but it's been made very well so far, is that we're showing good progress in getting out of this hub and spoke approach to security, where the US is at the center and Japan, Korea, allies and partners are kind of in the pointy ends, all looking to work through the US, and watching Japan and Australia, India, and others taking on a like-minded and a helpful role in global security. It just doesn't, the US doesn't need to be in the center of everything, and others have great ideas that we should learn from, listen to, and capitalize on. So I was just going to run just quickly down through, what an old military guy thinks in terms of the dime, diplomatic, information, military, and economic opportunities here. And those have been covered extensively. I would mention diplomatic. Lithuania's recent standing on principle with Taiwan, in using the word Taiwan and not Taipei, is very encouraging. And then their approach to Huawei is also useful. But the Czech Republic, remember the Czechs sent 90 legislators to Taiwan. They're ignoring the hollow threats from Beijing that, Taiwan's radioactive and you can't even think about going there. And they ignored that and they continued. And others are doing the same. While I was in government about this time last year, we sent Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar and then Keith Kroc, the Undersecretary for Economics, and others to Taiwan, basic to say these are all completely in bounds. There's nothing wrong with this, and we're not going to be dissuaded or deterred through shrill rhetoric. So the diplomatic aspect, I think, is important, must continue, and then Japan's stance, along with the US and others, empowers others to follow that. But the one we haven't talked about, and Tatsumi-san touched on it, and I think it's the one we really need to get at, is the information aspect, the political warfare aspect. The part that has convinced many in the world that Taiwan is radioactive, and this one China principle that says that the decision's been made already. Well, it hasn't been made. At least the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act, and I'm glad to hear that Japan's looking for some similar legislation, says that it's an open question, and we just ask that it be resolved peacefully through dialogue, without coercion or use of force. And we need to keep restating that, because that's a very meaningful, practical, and useful approach, contrary to the might makes right approach that we're seeing from across the straits. So I think I can get us back on time here in noting that Japan's approach to the PRC, internal political warfare through students, through news outlets, through these organizations that seem innocuous on the surface, but are in fact part of the United Front, is also very encouraging. What we need, and what I've asked my counterparts in Taiwan for, I don't have counterparts now, but I had, and the people I talk to now, we need Taiwan's expertise on this. I mean, nobody understands political warfare coming across the strait better than Taiwan does. And then that open cooperation on this subject, I think, will be a strong message to the rest of the world that, one, it exists. It's not just the US, howling at the moon on this, the Trump administration. It really does exist. And two, that these are things that we should all be interested in cooperate on. So as far as looking forward and how far you can go on this, I do think that the military aspect is absolutely necessary, but it's well rehearsed. We know this, we've been doing it for a long time. I would like to see this group and others expand on more things we can do in the diplomatic information and economic realm. I mean, it's going pretty well on the econ side, but and kudos to the cooperation on boycotts on pineapples and all those things. I commend to all of you the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, their work on Chinese pressure on Australia. Hopefully that would be expanded to include Taiwan. But I guess in summary, we got a lot more we can do, and we have a lot more we can do in areas that so far have not received a lot of attention, but would be in fact, I would be far more productive in a deterrent message than just simply focusing on military buildups and balancing power across the straits. And with that, I probably do better with questions than with statements. So I yield back.
All right, thank you so much. I think that's such a great point to wrap up on, right? It's not all about the M in dime, right? There's other instruments and vectors of national power that really matter. We've got a tremendous amount of sort of knowledge in our audience, so I want to turn it over to them for some Q&A, and we've already got, sorry about these sirens, we already got some good questions coming in. So the first one, I think we're going to start with Bill Sharp. And I just want to say the Q&A, a little housekeeping here. You have the option, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question in person, that's perfectly fine. Just I'll call on you, but you can also type, into the Q&A box. So we'll kind of do a hybrid Q&A model. So to go back to Bill Sharp's question, I think Yuki, you're probably going to be the on point here. Will the LDP's coalition partners, are they going to be an obstacle in these warming ties with Taiwan?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. This is actually a very predictable question, given the Komeito always has been looked at the kind of a center of the left balancer in the ruling coalition. But in this case, I really don't see that happening. And I say that precisely because of the point that I made in the beginning. LDP's center of the debate on this issue has clearly shifted. And Komeito has two choices to don't get in the way of LDP conversation in the LDP, to move forward and actually being the part of it and being a proactive member of the coalition to shape the agenda, rather than try to force a pullback on LDP. And I think Komeito, for this entire time that they have formed they have been a part of the ruling coalition with LDP, they actually often has worked as not rather as a bloc, but they're more of a responsible restraint against some of the kind of a too much forward-leaning side within the LDP when it comes to politically sensitive issues such as this. And my sense is that Komeito will probably choose to be a part of the stay in the part of the coalition and more proactively involved in this debate, and shaping the agenda for the Japan-Taiwan, especially on the parliamentary exchange relationship moving forward. And for that, also for that purpose, Mr. Kishida will be a much more, if suitable conduit and the coalition consultation partner for Komeito. They will feel much more comfortable taking a more of a cooperative approach vis-a-vis Mr. Kishida, as opposed to someone who is more like Ms. Takaichi, who is known for much more hardliner position toward the China, their PRC, therefore much more forward-leaning on what Japan will publicly or should be willing to do, because at the end of the day, that the General Stilwell rightly pointed out, Japan's official policy does remain that on the one China, which does bring in the certain set of the inevitable constraints as Japan pursues cooperation with the Taiwan.
Great. Okay, so the next question, I think this kind of takes us to the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is China's red lines, from Byron Callan. So, obviously there's some obvious red lines, but what would be China's red lines vis-a-vis Japan's actions on Taiwan? If there was, for example, the Japanese TRA, would that set China off or cabinet level visit. Let's go to Abe here. I think I saw you had your hand up to maybe take the first crack at this one.
Thanks. I don't think that red lines is a helpful metaphor to think about how China would react to this, because it's pretty binary in that you're on one side of the red line, then you're on the other side of the red line. Rather, I think that China would retaliate on basically any move that Japan would take to support Taiwan in any substantive mood, but the retaliation could be titrated and adjusted based on the seriousness that they want to convey, the amount of room they want to leave themselves to respond more harshly to other potential moves, a wide variety of different factors. But I'd want to make two other points on this. One is that we should not be legalistic when thinking about Chinese red lines or what they would tolerate with Japan. China's reactions will not be consistent with its reactions with the United States, that this is not based on a legalistic interpretation of what is and is not okay with Taiwan. Rather, it's based on power calculations. China tolerates the United States doing certain things with Taiwan because they have to, because the United States is so powerful that it's not in their interest to blow things up, figuratively speaking, over what we do with Taiwan. That doesn't mean that they would behave the same way with Japan. In fact, I expect that China would be willing to tolerate certain activities that the United States does with Taiwan that they would not tolerate with Japan, because they wouldn't have to, because Japan is seen as a weaker country than the United States. The last point I'd make is that when we talk about red lines, we often, it conjures these sort of extreme scenarios of going to war over some action, be it arms sales or a Japanese-Taiwan Relations Act, whatever it is. They have a lot of options besides that. They can cause a lot of pain with Japan economically, in terms of economic sanctions, potentially arresting Japanese business people operating in China. They can get more belligerent in disputed areas. They can conduct provocations against Japanese interests in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, whatever it may be. So they have a lot of options. And as long as they are inflicting pain, I think they would want to establish some degree of deterrence with Japan, so that if Japan did so much on Taiwan, that would deter them from going even further. So I'll stop there. I see other hands raised. I want to get out of the way.
Yuki, do you want to chime in on that?
Yes, so I agree with Dave, Abe, first of all, that it's really not a strict, binary issue. So what are the concrete red lines are, and China does do these behaviors measured on the calculations. And I think I would say, though, that while Japan was under Mr. Abe's care, at Mr. Abe's watch, one of the big strategic or tactical miscalculation that PRC did vis-a-vis Japan is I think they really misread Japan's response in reaction to their upping the aggressiveness or in their behavior in the East China Sea. I think their playbook was that if they really go belligerent and increase their aggressiveness, Japan would kind of come down on it and reach out to Beijing to look for a little bit more mutual, agreeable, kind of like a halfway solution that is not optimal for Japan, not really exactly optimal for Beijing, but Beijing kind of, I think, based on their past playbook, it was always Japan that reached out to Beijing to start that conversation. But miscalculation that Beijing made when Mr. Abe was leading Japan was that he did not reach out in that way. Instead, he turned around to the rest of the international community and start articulating and calling out on China on its misbehavior, and how it is really the responsibility of not just US, Japan, but then international community to do its part, each country doing its part to maintain this rule-based liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific region. I think, and then what I think Beijing even more miscalculated was that how many countries actually agreed with Japan when Japan's Mr. Abe starts articulating that at every single summit meeting that he had with his counterpart in this region. And also, Mr. Abe really doubled down on strengthening US-Japan alliance because he knew very well, just because precisely for the reason that Abe mentioned, that as long as Beijing continues to think that US-Japan alliance is a rock solid, the two countries are on the same page when it comes to certain Chinese misbehaviors, Chinese has to tolerate certain things that Japan does. Maybe they tolerate a little bit less than the US actions, but Beijing will have to tolerate that, even if they don't like it. So I would very much expect Mr. Kishida's government to basically fundamentally stay on that course moving forward. And I really don't think any radical change of course under any future Japanese leaders, unless Chinese behavior really starts to change dramatically.
Great. It's kind of fascinating points there about there kind of being two standards in Beijing for the US and Japan as far as different standards on Taiwan. The next question is kind of a complex one, and I think Russell will be well positioned to answer it. And the question is complicated because I think the KMT has been in a little bit of flux recently, to say the least. But Russell, what would, and let's not say Han Kuo-yu or whatever, but what would a sort of a KMT kind of a victory at the ballot box, what impact would you see that having on this relationship? Obviously, it would depend on the specific KMT candidate, but maybe you can make some kind of broad prognostications as far as that goes.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that is a complicated question, and largely hypothetical scenario. But I think we can sort of look at what has happened over the past weekend as a starting point for this analysis about a potential KMT administration and how that might affect relations with Japan and then with China as well. The first starting point is that the candidate that won the KMT chairmanship election just over the weekend is Eric Zhu. Now he is no stranger to the United States and to the international fora. He had served as chairman before of the party. He represents more of the moderate and established wing of the KMT, and so I think if he were the candidate and won in 2024, which is when the next presidential election will be held, I don't think that there will be any substantial disruption to relations with Japan. I think there might be some adjustments in terms of the KMT's approach to cross-strait relations, but overall, as I mentioned earlier, despite the tensions between Taiwan and Japan during the Ma Ying-jeou administration, two sides were able to at least set aside some of those differences and be able to ink that fisheries agreement in 2013. And I expect someone like Eric Zhu would sort of hew more closer to that wing of the party. However, that being said, even though that Eric Zhu had won, it is important to note also that the second runner in that race, who obtained over 30% of the vote, was a gentleman by the name of Zhang Yaozong. Now, he actually represents more of the pro-unification wing of the KMT and is aligned with the former chairwoman Hong Xiuzu, and also to some degree represents the broader faction of the sort of the anti-establishment wing of the KMT, most recently sort of headlined by the candidate Han Kuo-yu, who was the candidate of the KMT for the 2020 presidential election. Now, if it were the case that someone like Zhang Yazong, who had publicly advocated for the unification with China, and that could, I think, potentially disrupt, cross-strait relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations, and certainly Taiwan-Japan relations as well. In further complicating the delicate balance between the United States, Taiwan, and Japan and China as well. So I think those are sort of things that we have to watch. I think it's not clear yet whether or not Eric Xu has a mandate to lead the KMT, given the closeness of that race. So it will be important to watch whether or not he is able to consolidate power and be able to rejuvenate this sort of the more moderate and establishment wing of the party to that can potentially stabilize that party's foreign policy orientation that has come increasingly under strain because it has been sort of straying away from the mainstream public opinion of the Taiwanese electorate. And so first the next test will be actually in local elections next year in 2020 at the end of next year, and then with the presidential election in 2024.
Great. All right. So I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to kind of take moderator's prerogative here, and I want to pick up on something that General Stilwell had said regarding political warfare and disinformation, and specifically kind of get a sense from you all, what is the kind of scope for cooperation between Japan and Taiwan, but also other kind of like-minded partners on this? And I'm thinking specifically to the terrible incident involving Taiwan's representative in Osaka, who was essentially disinformation was a factor in his suicide, and basically a campaign targeting the Frank Xia, who's the Taiwanese representative in Japan, very close to Tsai Ing-wen. And there was an area where perhaps highlights a need for greater cooperation on disinformation. So I know that's a little bit in the weeds, but I would be fascinated to hear a take from anyone on the panel on that.
Well, if you don't mind, I can start off since I raised it. All these problems look enormous, and it's very difficult to address. But as we've seen, all you have to do is just point to it and get people to stop denying it and offer good evidence that says this is going on. And there's no better example than Australia. I mean, I think we can all look at what Australia went through, and in the book Silent Invasion, depiction of, all of the multiple avenues of manipulation and just interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, which is their policy, not non-interference. So I don't think you have to solve the whole problem. You just have to get people to start looking for it and stop explaining it away. And in that regard, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, Anne-Marie Brady have done a really good job. It's just a matter of just education, but you got to stay at it. You got to keep talking about it.
Great. Abe, do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. And I was glad that Dave mentioned Anne-Marie Brady's work. I should note, published by the Wilson Center on Chinese influence activities and the use of the United Front Department. Her article called "Magic Weapons" I just think is phenomenal and really important reading on this. The other point that I'd make on this, that I completely agree, the need to talk about this, the need to share information on China's activities, but I also think we can learn a lot from each other in how we deal with disinformation. Just prior to the shutdown of the pandemic, we hosted Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, who talked with us about how Taiwan responded to disinformation from the mainland during their just completed election. They had some very innovative tactics that they used, both on the cyber side, but also on the political messaging side. That I think, in some ways would be impossible for us to do from a legal perspective, just different legal systems. But also there's just a lot of really interesting ideas that they have. And I think working together to share best practices, to share experiences, and to generate new ideas on how we respond and how we protect our democracies, I think is something that Taiwan could really be a leader on, since they've been on the front lines of this for longer than anybody else, in helping Japan, Australia, the United States, democracies across the Indo-Pacific and really around the world. I think we have a lot to learn from them, and maybe we could help them in other countries in terms of capacity and capability.
Thanks. Russell, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I think this is such an important topic, and I really appreciate General Stillwell for raising it first in his opening comment. I think, generally, I think, the saying goes that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think in the case of disinformation and political warfare, this is absolutely the case. And so, greater transparency of these activities, both in terms of shedding light on it through, both official disclosures as well as academic research, are going to be very important in being able to promote better public understanding about these issues. Secondly, I think it's also important to develop a uniform legal approach to dealing with this problem, and we have to deal with through our democratic process, and obviously not adopt the same types of tactics that authoritarian countries do in approaching this issue, through censorship and other means. And so we need to adopting a legal approach through our legal processes that can handle these matters in a manner that won't also strain our democratic institutions, which is I think very critical in addressing this overall problem. I think the issue that the particular case that you referenced in terms of disinformation regarding the very terrible and tragic death of the Taiwanese diplomat in Osaka, that creates a real problem, because the platform on which those disinformation was spread on was not controlled by the Japanese government, in the Japanese. So to be able to do so, would require a degree of information sharing that and speed as well. That I think currently right now we're I don't think we're at a point where we can be responsive enough to really address one of the damaging effects of disinformation. One hard part of dealing with disinformation is how quickly it can spread, and when it does spread, that effect already has been can materialize and metastasize. So we have to sort of be able to address that part of that in that particular case. I think just going back earlier to the broader point that I was trying to reference in my opening statement with regards to political warfare tactics with regards to Japan. I think the media in Japan actually probably scores a pretty high mark in terms of how it deals with disinformation, particularly from the PRC. In one way, it's part of the nature, it's just sort of the structure and nature of the media industry in Japan, where it's very consolidated and it's very hard. And there isn't really a big sort of open sort of, media space where, non-traditional media outlets are able to really, sort of affect the public space, as in, what we get oftentimes elsewhere with social media. But, I do think that there are, real ways in which China is engaged through the fringe elements within Japanese society that appears to be where the the targets of political warfare activities are concentrated in large part because the mainstream and public population are more difficult to influence, but the fringe elements are certainly there, and there are really interesting sort of cases where you see political warfare outfits engaged with religious organizations, with media organizations, to chess associations or sort of a Go association. I'm sorry, not American style chess. That are going on, and and as I referenced earlier, the personnel aspect of how really key figures in the political warfare apparatus that was targeting Taiwan, primarily by the name of someone by the name of Xing Qi, Major General, having turned his focus clearly in his portfolio on Japan post 2016. Is instructive of sort of the emphasis by which China is engaged in this, turned its attention on this in this area. So I'll leave it there. But I think this is a really fascinating topic that we can really go into a lot further on and really unpack and dissect and analyze. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. Yeah, and I encourage everyone also to check out. There's a chapter in Yuki's report specifically looking at the disinformation challenges facing both Taiwan and Japan. Yuki, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Actually, Russell pretty much covered what I meant to add, but just again, just wanted to flag. And then I think I intended to send it to everyone, and I think you just sent it to you, John, the link to the report. But there is a chapter in my edited volume that John mentioned at the beginning that actually does address this issue, and Japan does, as Russell mentioned. I mean, it's really Japan is really finally grappling the impact of what it can happen. And then I think this very unfortunate incident in Osaka was very much of a wake up call for those people who didn't quite grasp the severity of the what kind of damage it can do. So I think it is Japan is still much in the learning phase of how to identify it, how to deal with it. And then I think Japan can very much does have a lot to learn from Taiwanese experience, but then also a US experience as well.
Great. I think that's a really great topic to end on. I don't think it's necessarily covered to the extent that it should be. I really want to thank all of our panelists today for taking their time and lending their insights into this important relationship. I think that's finally getting some of the attention that it deserves. I just wanted to mention that we will have a recording of this event on our YouTube page, so it will live in posterity. And so please feel free to check that out, and also all of Jamestown's publications and work at jamestown.org. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week.